Pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and redeemer. Amen. As my story goes, I was born in Seoul, South Korea, where my mother left me at the hospital for reasons I may never know. A short time later, on the other side of the world, a young couple named Jim and Frances Wright of Oklahoma City walked into the Dillon Adoption Agency, where they expressed their interest in adopting a Korean baby boy. Now, on that day, the first file that the caseworker just happened to reach for was mine. And that is how, instead of my story involving orphanages and uncertainty, it involved a loving and caring family. Stories can change in an instant, and sometimes the catalyst for such change is so ostensibly minute or insignificant that it barely registers in our recollection of how things happen. But when a story does change, regardless of whether or not we recognize the cause or crux, what cannot be denied is that at one point, at one time, something in the story shifted. It moved, it careened off course so as to upset the narrative and dispense an alternate ending from what would have been. In our story today, Jesus and his disciples are attending a wedding in Cana of Galilee, a city only mentioned here in the Gospel of John. Jesus is there along with his disciples and his mother Mary. Now, there is an open bar, and whether because the groom was too cheap or the guests too thirsty, they run out of wine. Many turn to Jesus, and Mary turns to Jesus, and she alerts him to this predicament, and Jesus responds in a way that makes you wonder if Mary wasn't ready to wash his mouth out with soap. He says, "Woman, that will get you right there enough to get your mouth washed out." What concern is that to you? And to me, my hour has not yet come. Get that bar of Irish Spring ready. Now, maybe Jesus is too busy having a good time with his friends. Maybe he's wondering why in the world his mother would bother him with such information. And that's actually a really good question. Why would Mary mention this to Jesus? As readers of the text standing 2,000 years away from this story, we might say that it made perfect sense for Mary to bring this issue to Jesus' attention. But remember, we know that this is the Jesus who feeds the 5,000, Jesus who raises Lazarus from the dead, Jesus who walks on water. But at this point in the gospel narrative, and the author makes this clear, these events have not yet occurred. Turning water into wine would be Jesus' first sign. So it's not clear at all that Mary or anyone else at that wedding recognizes the full giftedness, potential, and identity of this son of a carpenter. To Mary and to everyone else, he's simply Jesus who was born in Bethlehem. Jesus, who grew up at Nazareth. Jesus, who is Mary's +1 at the wedding. In fact, it could very well be that Mary simply states this information in a rather flippant, haphazard, almost talking to oneself sort of way. They ran out of wine. They're probably gonna run out of the fish option next. And if this is the case, then Mary is simply speaking the reality of the situation in the presence of someone she did not know who was there. We do this all the time. We go on a rant about how terrible something is, only to realize that the person we're speaking about is standing right behind us. And if this is the case, then because Jesus is present and hears Mary's words, the story, it shifts in a way, it changes so that no one could have expected what happens next. The water was turned into wine, and not just the cheap box stuff you buy at Costco and hope that no one judges you for drinking, but the good stuff, the expensive vintage, the private reserve saved for special occasions. The story changes because Jesus, the living, breathing sign that God is with us and has not left us to ourselves, is in the room. In his masterpiece, Strength to Love, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. writes, "Above all, we must be reminded anew that God is at work in his universe. He is not outside the world looking on with a sort of cold indifference. Here on all the roads of life, he is striving in our striving. Like an ever-loving Father, he is working through history for the salvation of his children. As we struggle to defeat the forces of evil, the God of the universe struggles with us. Evil dies on the seashore, not merely because of man's endless struggle against it, but because of God's power to defeat it." Dr. King was able to write these words not because he was delusional, but because he realized that the ideals in the vision of beloved community were underwritten by the intimate presence of God's own heart, Jesus Christ. He recognized that the Jesus who was in the room when the wine ran out was not the sentimental, judgmental, fire and brimstone Jesus that we've made him out to be, but the same Jesus who was on the bus when Rosa Parks was asked to give up her seat. The same Jesus who linked arms with John Lewis and Amelia Boynton Robinson as they marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The same Jesus who wept with the congregation of the 16th Street Baptist Church after a bomb ripped through their building, killing 4 precious girls. The same Jesus. In his book, The Beloved Community, historian Charles Marsh recounts how on November 12th, 1956, Dr. King sat in court, listening as the city of Montgomery demanded $15,000 in damages for a bus boycott that he had helped start, and also that the network of carpools devised by African Americans be shut down. At the noon recess, a reporter from the Associated Press approached the tired and wearied King. The reporter carried with him a clipping from the newswire. "Here's the decision you've been waiting for," he said. Dr. King read the article and gave a tired but grateful sigh of relief. For on that wire, it read that the U.S. Supreme Court had upheld decisions declaring that Alabama's bus segregation laws were illegal. That evening, 40 carloads of Klansmen rolled through the black neighborhoods of Montgomery. But instead of hiding away from the windows, black residents swung open their front doors and gathered on the porches, waving at the hooded men as they drove by. As Dr. King would recount, as though they were waving at a circus parade. Now, if you're wondering how someone like Dr. King could say that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, then stories like this should begin to explain that this statement was not based upon faulty optimism or naivete. Rather, Dr. King witnessed the story changing before his very eyes and believed that it would continue to change because God was in the room, overhearing what was being said and acting on behalf of the vision of beloved community. Sometimes the change occurs at painstakingly slow speeds. After all, we wonder how in 2016, the achievement gap between black and brown students and white students can remain so stubbornly high, or how gifted actors of color and gifted actresses of color can be shut out of awards ceremonies. Which, by the way, if you're planning on watching the Oscars this year, don't worry if you don't have one of those televisions that shows color, because there won't be much color to see. And yet our gospel today invites us to ponder the audacious possibility that when the wine runs out and all looks lost, when the future is still not yet, there stands Jesus in the room, moving to change the story. The story changes, friends. It always changes when God is present, whether or not we recognize that she is there among us. Let's be clear on this. When we speak of and work towards the world that we believe God longs to bring into justice, we are not writing checks that cannot be cashed. You cannot overdraft on God's power or promises. Rather, we speak things that are true. And when we speak these things and when we attempt to do these things, we do so because we believe that the presence and power of God is right here in this room, attending to things with us, guiding us, delivering us, helping us to change the story of our lives and of our world. To the rest of the world, it may seem like we are simply being naive or strange, frequently disposed to speaking at the sky. And yet the good news of the gospel today is that these things we care so deeply about, these longings of our heart that sometimes we express only in the deepest of silences, are overheard and acted upon by God, who is in the room right along with us. And so today we reflect on the story of this poorly planned party because it tells us much about how our own stories beg to be changed by the story of the Jesus who stands in the room hearing our prayers for justice. The same Jesus who gets arrested along with other protesters in Raleigh, North Carolina, decrying Jim Crow-like voting laws and unjust economic policies. The same Jesus who, like Eric Gardner, cannot breathe underneath the weight of brutal and harsh police tactics. The same Jesus who holds the broken and bruised body of Tamir Rice in that Cleveland, Ohio park when no one else will. The same Jesus who now, right now, friends, threatens the story of the Riverside Church with resurrection, changing the story, changing your story and my story, as if the future of God's beloved community here on earth depends on it. Because it does. It does depend on it. That's just how the story changes. Amen.